Tonight on The Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.
Bell Labs employed about 15,000 people, including some 1,200 PhDs. Its ranks included the world's most brilliant and eccentric men and women.
The Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley was Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. As author Jon Gertner says, it's where the future, which we now call the present, was conceived and designed. Tonight, Gertner talks about his book, The Idea Factory and Bell Labs, with KQED's Dave Iverson. Major funding for Revolutionaries is provided by the Intel Corporation.
At the peak of its reputation in the late 1960s, Bell Labs employed about 15,000 people, including some 1,200 PhDs. Its ranks included the world's most brilliant and eccentric men and women.
I'd like to ask you, if you would, Jon, just to begin by reading the first paragraph of the book from The Idea Factory, Bell Labs, and the Great Age of American Innovation, because it lays out what is so significant about this story.
Sure. This does mention Google, I should mention, but that's purely coincidental. This book is about the origins of modern communications as seen through the adventures of several men who spent their careers working at Bell Telephone Laboratories. Even more, though, this book is about innovation, about how it happens, why it happens, and who makes it happen. It is likewise about why innovation matters, not just to scientists, engineers, and corporate executives, but to all of us. That the story is about Bell Labs, and even more specifically about life at the labs between the late 1930s and the mid-1970s, isn't a coincidence. In the decades before the country's best minds began migrating west to California's Silicon Valley, many of them came east to New Jersey, where they worked in capacious brick and glass buildings located on grassy campuses where deer would graze at twilight. At the peak of its reputation in the late 1960s, Bell Labs employed about 15,000 people, including some 1,200 PhDs. Its ranks included the world's most brilliant and eccentric men and women. In a time before Google, the labs sufficed as the country's intellectual utopia. It was where the future, which is what we now happen to call the present, was conceived and designed. For a long stretch of the 20th century, Bell Labs was the most innovative scientific organization in the world.
So in many ways, though we'd like to think that it all happened right here within just a stone's throw of this building, is it fair to think of the Bell Labs as Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley?
I think so. It did all happen here, and it did all happen there. It just happened there a little bit before it happened here. And I think so. I mean, some of the things that you see now in the Valley, I think that the kind of freedom given engineers and researchers, the small teams attacking big problems within a larger ecosystem that could help support them with advice, with money, with all sorts of other things. I think a lot of that, does go back to that kind of formula at Bell Labs. The near-term thinking and the long-term thinking, as Jon had said in the introduction, and giving autonomy to people who are very capable.
Give us some sense of all of the things that came out of the Bell Labs in those glory years. Jon mentioned, of course, the things that are exhibited here at the museum, the transistor and the adder. But the list is impressive. So just rattle off, if you would, some of the things that grew out of that experience.
Sure. Bell Labs began in 1925 as the research and development wing of the telephone company. But a lot of my book is really focused on those post-war years. Its heyday really began, I guess you could say, in 1947 with the invention of the transistor, the point contact transistor by John Bardeen and Walter Brattain. Pretty soon after, Bill Shockley came up with the junction transistor, and then a host of other kinds of transistors. Transistor processes followed. There was a silicon solar cell, for instance, in 1954, which is the precursor for solar panels today. There were digital communications, Claude Shannon's information theory, looking at coding and channel capacity. Communications satellites were originally designed and begun at Bell Labs. The Unix operating system, the C language came out of Bell Labs in the late 60s. The CCD chip, which is the charge-coupled device, which is really this fundamental unit for digital photography in our cell phones. The theory of the laser, A lot of the semiconductor room temperature lasers came out of Bell Labs, which are still essential to fiber optic communications, as well as they're in every DVD player. It was a pretty big list.
Pretty big list.
Yeah.
And how did that happen to come out of Ma Bell? I mean, what's the significance of the name? You know, what's in the name? And how did that matter that would lead to that trail of all of those things that you just described?
Sure. A little bit of history probably helps. The Bell Labs actually was formed after the phone company had been around for about 45 years. AT&T was a monopoly. They controlled 80 to 90% of the telephone service in the United States. They were a vertically integrated company. They owned one of the largest manufacturing companies in the world, Western Electric, as well. In the early years, in the beginning of the 20th century, Western Electric had its own engineering department, and AT&T, its parent company, had its own engineering department. There was a bit of tension and competitiveness between the two. In 1925, they agreed they would create this standalone lab, Bell Laboratories, as this sort of bottom box on this vertical stack of a company. So ideas would come out of Bell Labs, ideas and development. They would be transferred to Western Electric, the manufacturing part of the company, and eventually they would be deployed by AT&T, which controlled the long-distance lines as well as about 23 either parts or whole of the operating telephone companies.
And some of the problems that they had to, you read a lot about it being a problem-rich environment, and I want to spend some time talking about that. But give us some sense of sort of the early problems they had to contend with. Like, there wasn't a dial tone, right? I mean, there were very basic problems that had to be solved.
Everything. I mean, the early phones used batteries. There was no dial tones. There were no ringers. There were no hang-up things. The amount of detail that went into designing operator headsets for these women who sat at switchboards, you know, teams of people would work on these problems for years. Teams of chemists, as I talk about in the book, would work on the sheathing for cables. Other teams would work on the insulation between the sheathing and the cables. There was a level of detail, an amount of work that was pretty much endless. The problems kept proliferating.
And was it sort of a first time when science was deployed to solve those sorts of product problems?
There was. I mean, there was a very small research department at the beginning, and again, Bell Labs was not a huge glom of people in one big department. There was about 10 to 15% of them were working in basic research and applied research. The vast majority were working in development, so they were looking at near term. They were mostly engineers, whereas most of the science PhDs were in the research department. The research department started out very small. In the book, I talk a little bit about how its great success with the repeater tube, the early vacuum tubes that could amplify phone signals in the early part of the 20th century, really gave credibility to this small research department at Bell Labs. They succeeded in deploying a cross-country phone link, and from then on, the research department at Bell Labs grew and grew as it sort of worked more fundamentally on the science.
And was it integral, John, to its growth? I mean, you list these amazing statistics that there were 15,000 people there, and at one time over several thousand PhDs. Was it integral to that process that there were so many problems? I mean, were they, in a sense, looking for problems to solve?
There were. I mean, the question of what made Bell Labs succeed is a really interesting one, and I always say there's not one reason. But that's, I think, one of the main reasons. They were connected to a company with everyday practical problems. And even for the people working in applied research, and perhaps even to those working in basic research on these really far-reaching problems, the notion that their work was attached to a company, that it could be practically implemented, that they were dealing with everyday real problems was an incredible catalyst, I think, to do.
So is it an argument for monopoly? That's a good thing?
I've been accused of being a closet monopolist. No, in fact, I wrote a draft of the book, and then I wondered, gee, nobody could read this book and think I'm for monopolies, could they? So I went back and I added a line saying it's obvious that there's no reason for a monopoly now. But that apparently some people have skipped over that line. No, it's not an argument for monopoly, although it is a matter of, I think, personally for me, sitting with a contradiction that as we've come to understand, I think that monopolies are not good for consumers. They limit choice. They can increase the cost of technology. They can slow the rate of innovation. At this point in time, during this period of the United States when telecommunications was being developed, the monopoly, I think, arguably was fairly good for the country in that it created Bell Labs and allowed it to think long-term and work long-term on these very vexing problems.
I mean, part of the reason why I asked the question is that part of what comes through in the book is there's this sense that people had freedom, they had time, they had teams to work together. There wasn't necessarily this sense of, we got to get this done tomorrow. And that came in a sense because they had a captured market, right? I mean, they didn't have to worry about competition.
They had money. Yeah, they did. They were, I'm being attached to a monopoly, gave them time. Things built by AT&T and Western Electric were meant to stay in service for 30 to 40 years, which is when we now think of a market product being having a life of a year or 2 or 3 years, maybe 4. These were built to last, and they
even telephone poles, right? That's why they came out of Bell Labs. That's why they last forever.
It's right. Bell Labs had this. Bell Labs wasn't just one lab; it was a few different labs in New Jersey, and they had a small laboratory in Chester, New Jersey, which is sort of a country town, and they would bury phone poles halfway up. And they would just spend years, putting fungicides on them, seeing what worked better. They would test gophers to see the gophers would eat through the cables, and they wanted to make sure they could have the best cables. It was a company in pursuit of excellence with the money to pursue that excellence, I think, and the time and that luxury of time.
It's interesting because, again, as we come back to this thought of how it was different in some significant ways from the mantra that we think of here in Silicon Valley. And you referenced in a recent New York Times story, quoting Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, saying that their mantra is to move fast and break things. And it seems like, in some ways, you have this interesting contrast between Bell Labs, sort of the big and the slow, versus the quick and the nimble. I mean, is part of your argument that there's a value to being big and slow?
I think so. I don't think one's better than the other, but I do think the balance is pretty valuable, or has proven pretty valuable. I really like living in a world with Facebook and Google, and I use them both. And I think that Bell Labs could move fast at times for Telstar, for instance, which was a project that was done very much under the gun and was actually organized in a matter of months to see if they could achieve this very difficult engineering problem in a very quick time frame. But I do think that it's worth asking that question, which I asked in that New York Times piece, whether we need more of a balance or more of that kind of long-term, long-range, slower, maybe more methodical. We don't get there as fast. We don't get satisfied as fast, but sometimes I do think the breakthroughs that come about from it can create new industries, as they did in the case of Bell Labs.
And you referenced this wonderful quote from Bill Gates in the book, in which he said that if he had the ability to take part in time travel, his first stop would be Bell Labs in November of 1947. So set the stage for us. Why would it be that Bill Gates would want to go there then? What was going on that made it such a rich and inviting place to visit?
Okay. If you got in that time travel machine, you would go back to Murray Hill, New Jersey, which if you live in California, you might not want to go back to. But it was a very, very nice place, actually. I grew up pretty close to there. It was leafy and wooded, and it was a campus atmosphere. What these guys were working on is part of the answer, I think, to that question. The phone company had essentially, I guess you could say, 2 elements in it that were especially problematic. One was telephone switches, which are relays, which clicked open and clicked closed. When we just saw the George Stibitz model, you saw some relays in there. They broke all the time. They wore out. I think there were millions of them within the phone system. They connected callers to each other, and they were slow. They moved. Mervyn Kelley, who's a main character in my book, stopped Bill Shockley, somebody who he just hired the year before, in the hall and said, if there's one thing we could do, if we could just replace these switches with something electronic, it would be, just a tremendous advantage for the phone company. In addition to the switches, there were also these vacuum tubes. Kelley also had spent the early part of his life working on these vacuum tubes. They used vast amounts of power, as a lot of people know. They broke fairly often. They didn't operate cold. You had to warm them up. Those two were an integral part of repeating phone calls to get them farther distances. So switches, vacuum tubes, and in turn, Mervyn Kelley created this solid-state team in 1945, right after World War II. It took them a couple years to get to that time travel moment. And this was a team of people working, co-led by Bill Shockley. If I could talk for a second about what this team was, Mervyn Kelley, who was the head of research who set them up, it might sound sort of obvious today, but he did something very radical in creating this. He made it unusually interdisciplinary. He didn't just want physicists working with other physicists. He very much believed that actually new knowledge comes from the interface of different disciplines. He wanted physicists, chemists, metallurgists, electrical engineers working together, experimentalists, theorists, loners, people who were extroverted, introverted. And in that sense, he thought that would be the best way of attacking that problem. The second thing he did that was rather interesting, I think, too, is Kelley had spent his entire career, in fact, he built his entire reputation on vacuum tubes, on making them better. He used to run a vacuum tube shop for Western Electric. And in creating this team to create what ultimately resulted in the transistor, he was kind of attacking that innovator's dilemma head-on. If they succeed, it would render his entire career in science essentially irrelevant, which in retrospect, to me at least, seems rather courageous.
And he also did something interesting in sort of upsetting the apple cart of who was in charge, right? He put Shockley in charge in a way that upset people there, and he was willing to sort of take some risks, not only in bringing people together in different disciplines, but also not necessarily going by seniority.
That's right. He put the youngest people who, with the most expertise in this new branch of science and in quantum mechanics, and the physicists who were most recently really out of MIT and Caltech in charge of this group and leadership positions. And the old guard, some of them were demoted effectively. And there was a quote in there that there were people crying in offices. It was a revolution, as they called it.
And there was also this sense, you say at one point that the purpose of the solid-state group was not so much to build something as to understand it. So it's again this idea that it wasn't like we got to get this done tomorrow. There was this, it was a scientific pursuit. It was a scientific pursuit.
Some of the men in the back of their minds did believe that a device would be found if they could understand it. Again, it kind of goes back to Mervyn Kelley's philosophy, I think. In the early part of Kelley's career, he shared an office with a guy named Clinton Davison, whose name might be familiar. He won a Nobel Prize in 1937. But in the early days, in the teens and 20s, Kelley and Davison shared an office, and they were really like the original odd couple. Kelley was this antic, robust, fast-moving. He might have had ADD, I don't know, but he was paired with Clinton Davison, who was slow-moving, phlegmatic. He weighed about like 110 pounds. He was always sick. He would go home and sit in his stocking cap and write equations in a notebook. And yet Kelley developed this kind of awe for Davison. And he realized that when nobody else knew the answer to a problem at Bell Labs, and especially a problem involving the science of what was going on with, say, a problematic device, nobody could answer it, but Davison could. And in imparting not just advice on how to fix something, but imparting a deeper understanding on his colleagues, they could not just do twice as good. They could create improvements in the work they were doing, like by orders of magnitude, and that understanding something was power, essentially.
I want to read this one passage where you talk about, again, Mervyn Kelley, and you say at one point, Kelley would not want to begin a project by focusing on what was known. He would want to begin by focusing on what was not known. The approach was both difficult and counterintuitive. It was more common practice to proceed with what technology would allow and fill in the gaps afterwards. Kelley's tack was akin to saying, locate the missing puzzle pieces first, and then do the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And I think that sums up in many ways why the transistor team was created and what its goals were. Understand what we don't know, and we will solve the puzzle, so to speak.
So tell us something more about Bill Shockley's role, who of course is known here, in the end became infamous in many ways for the theories he took, particularly in matters of race. But what was his role in this? And tell us something about the sort of competitiveness of him, that he in some ways kind of violated the norm of the Bell Labs by the way in which he went after this.
It was an intensely collaborative group. This was an era before cubicles. There was an open door policy. Nobody was to be refused advice, no matter how well-known or famous you were. In the solid-state group that began in 1945 and culminated with this invention of the transistor, Shockley, as a co-leader, sort of led the work. But yet, when Bardeen and Bratton made advances that ultimately resulted in the point contact transistor, Shockley certainly became envious, jealous, and became himself fascinated by the idea of improving this idea, their work already. And pretty shortly thereafter, it resulted in something called the junction transistor. And Shockley, the rule at Bell Labs not only was open door, but that you were not to compete with the people you managed. A Nobel Prize winner, Phil Anderson, when I interviewed him for the book, he said, this was the transgression Shockley made and could never be forgiven. And it set him on a path, I think, increasingly, in the weeks after that and the months after that, this transistor team that was intensely collaborative, very cohesive, broke apart. John Bardeen, pretty soon after, went to Illinois to become a professor. Bratton left working with Shockley completely just to pursue his own projects. Eventually, Shockley was stuck in a kind of middle management position at Bell Labs. I mean, as brilliant as Shockley was, it was very clear to the management, to Mervyn Kelley, who I just mentioned, that Shockley was never going to succeed at managing people. And it was a matter of using Shockley's great abilities and phenomenal intellect the best they could. He became increasingly frustrated with this, and by 1955, he decided to leave and come out here and start Shockley Semiconductor, and as probably everybody in this room knows, he hired some pretty good people. Yeah.
And there is some thought, or at least some implication in your book, that while his career sort of went off in various directions then and wound up in some degree, as I mentioned before, with controversy, if not infamy, that if he had stayed at Bell Labs, that might have been contained. That part of him that was sort of whatever tragic flaw he might have had might have been contained if he had stayed within the more collegial realm of Bell Labs.
Yeah, in a conversation with Ian Ross, he had made that argument. I think it's an interesting argument. I don't know. I mean, if it's a hypothetical. Knowing something about Shockley's character from spending a lot of time reading about him, researching him, talking with people who knew him, I wonder if he could have been satisfied staying in that position. He increasingly wanted to pursue, as maybe all of us do, more and more ambitious goals, and to stay in a kind of middle management position, or even just a pure research position. Like some other people in the book, for instance, like Claude Shannon, who really had no aspirations to manage people at all. He just wanted to do his work. And I think there was this other model, Clinton Davison, Kelley's best friend, who was really a pure researcher. There were these other folks who were revered at Bell Labs, but they were not on the management track. They held a very high stature, but I'm not sure Shockley would have ever chosen that or could have by temperament.
Coming back to the transistor for a moment, did Bell Labs know what it had?
That's a question that fascinated me. at the time, I mean, there is there's a school of history that says they didn't. Everything that I read definitely says they did. In fact, the day after the transistors unveiling, the president of Bell Labs, even after it had been buried in the New York Times on page 46 or something, that were not, that it had been not seen as this kind of huge breakthrough. That
a reminder to all of us about the New York Times.
Well, I don't think we're very good at seeing breakthroughs when they happen. And in that case, the day after the president of Bell Labs, Oliver Buckley, had written a note to his former boss, the first president of Bell Labs, and said, this looks very important to us. And it really was. And if you look at the internal correspondence that was coming in to the researchers at Bell Labs at the time, really every major corporation was writing to them begging for samples. So RCA, Zenith, the big electronics companies at the time, sending letters not just to one guy, but thinking maybe if we send one to Shockley and Bardeen, Bratton, Kelley, Ralph Bound, the head of research, they'll give us one of these so we can test it. A very interesting question, though, is whether they knew its application in computers. They knew it would be useful in the phone system for amplifiers and possibly switches. And the only thing I found was a couple weeks after the unveiling of the transistor, an MIT professor, Jay Forrester, wrote a note to Bell Labs, I think to Ralph Bound, the head of research, and said, can you please send us some? Because we think it really has some application in high-speed computers that we're building here. I don't know how high speed they are in retrospect, but at MIT he was building these, and immediately, not all the letters would get a response, but immediately Ralph Bound wrote back and said, yes, we will send them to you right away, and let us know if there's anything we can do to sort of make them work for you. It's unclear from my research whether the brass at Bell Labs understood that kind of computing application at first, but certainly with the Forrester letter, it became very clear.
But they did share the technology. I mean, that's an interesting part of this story, too. It wasn't something that they were trying to hoard. Why was that?
In later years, after the mid-1950s, they had to share. They entered into a consent decree with the United States government, which only allowed them to use their technology for telephone applications or military applications. But in the late 1940s, it's true they could have theoretically kept it to themselves. But even though they had this monopoly status, it was, you can read, as I did some of the internal correspondence at the time between the management of Bell Labs, they felt that it was too big and too significant, which almost answers your previous question too. Did they think it was big? They thought it was so big that they had to share it. That the idea that this essentially publicly funded laboratory could keep this technology to itself would not have been acceptable.
I want to ask you something, and then we'll come back to talk more about innovation and the way in which it proceeded there. But it's worth noting that they had a few misses, right? So describe the picture phone.
Sure. Yeah, they had a lot of misses. They had, I mean, the transistor team had a lot of misses leading up to the breakthrough. I think anybody who works in the innovative process knows that failure is a huge part of that, and that it almost always precedes success. But then again, there were misses and failures that failed in the marketplace disastrously, and the picture phone is just one of these incredibly expensive follies that just did a big, huge belly flop, and it was as usual, it was great engineers working on it, and it was this as a visual communications device that was going to change the world. We would all be communicating by picture phone, the Bell Labs managers believed, within 10 or 20 years after it was rolled out. But pretty soon after, within 12 months or 18 months, I think something like 40 people had signed up in Pittsburgh for it, and the failure of it became pretty apparent. I interviewed some of the guys who worked on the picture phone, and some of them would make the case to me, with Skype and with Google Chats, we were right, and I think that's true. But I think it proves that idea that you can be early and be wrong, and that's part of innovation too.
And so, what do you take from that? I mean, as you think about what we learned from Bell Labs on those misses, where did they go wrong? What was it that led them down that particular path of the picture phone without some sort of self-correction? Was it that you were allowed to pursue those things? So it was the same thing, I guess. Was their strength also their weakness? That because you had time, you could also pursue something that turned out to be folly?
I think it could be. I think that's right. And I think there were different kinds of failures that occurred there, or different kinds of misses. For instance, the fiber optic breakthrough came through at Corning. It did not come through from Bell Labs. And at Bell Labs, they were pursuing something called the waveguide pipe, which was going to carry phone signals through a specially designed hollow pipe. And that was, I think, I talk about in the book whether these are mistakes of perception of what the future will be or will need, or whether there's mistakes of judgment. And I think the picture phone was a mistake of judgment in many ways. Somebody who worked on it just talked to me as if it was, and said to me pretty convincingly it was kind of groupthink, where none of us who were working on it actually even believed it could possibly fail.
Is it in part then a place where there wasn't a consequence to failure? I mean, that you were, Bill Langston, who, as some of you may know, runs the Parkinson's Institute, brilliant scientist, said to me once, quoted something, which was that science is the process of going up alleys to see if they're blind. And it occurs to me in listening to you that there's wonderful things that comes from that, but that also then it allows for you to go down blind alleys.
I think so. One of the characters in my book that I spent a lot of time writing about was this guy, John Pierce, who actually finished his career here at Stanford and worked at Caltech too, and was at Bell Labs for really most of his career. And I went through Pierce's papers, and I came across something he had written a few years before he died. He was considering writing a book about Bell Labs, and he tried to sort of take apart what made it work. And he had a sort of four-part formula, and one of those was that a researcher who's pursuing something, the research should be terminated without damning the researcher, that there should be no consequences for failure, so to speak. But again, that's probably, there's specific failure and then there's systemic failure, I think, which the picture phone may be more closely represented. And there was enough money that the consequences were not ever going to be dire.
Let me ask you one more thing about the process of discovery, and then we'll start getting to some of your questions as well. You write early in the book, John, about Eureka moments, and I just want to read this one passage because it seems so applicable to what happened at Bell Labs. We usually imagine that invention occurs in a flash, with a Eureka moment that leads to a lone inventor toward a startling epiphany. In truth, large leaps forward in technology rarely have a precise point of origin. At the start, forces that precede an invention merely begin to align, often imperceptibly, as a group of people and ideas converge until over the course of months or years or even decades, they gain clarity and momentum. It seems like so much of what happened at Bell Labs was not the Eureka moment. It really was this collection where the whole, in the end, was the product of the sum of the parts, or even more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the people there, especially in the early days, would maintain that they were building on things coming out of Rutherford's lab, out of breakthroughs in Europe, for instance, at the time, and that kind of alignment of ideas, that accretion of ideas and discoveries leading up to something big was really just a matter of course for science and engineering.
And do you think we're lacking that now? That ability to allow more than just for the Eureka moment, to allow for that long unfolding of discovery?
Well, I think that I find myself having to put on take off the writer hat and put on the pundit hat, and it's been a difficult process. But I think. As a reality check, we still fund a tremendous amount of research and development in this country to the tune of something like $150 billion a year. A lot of that goes to military research. A lot of it goes to Department of Energy, NASA. A great chunk of it goes to medical research. Smaller amounts go to basic research. it's a different system now. It's a more distributed model, certainly. We look to universities and national laboratories, whereas venture capital firms fund more shorter time businesses with a shorter time horizon. Is it as good or effective as what we've had? I don't know. I think there are definitely gains. There are probably or possibly some losses. Sometimes I wonder if we should talk about it more at the very least, because I think it's a very rich and complicated problem. And I mean, I've been to manufacturing conferences in Washington, for instance, where people in the White House talk about our loss of manufacturing prowess and how that was a vital part of Bell Labs and Western Electric too, that they had this ability to not just invent, but to develop and really bring these things to manufacturing in a way that required great expertise.
And you make the point in the book also that that's, in your view, one of the problems with outsourcing is that you lose that connection between creativity and product. And you lose the chance for sometimes that sort of interdisciplinary walking down the hallway, who will you bump into, that leads to something else.
I think so. I mean, I think, Andy Grove made the case very eloquently in Business Week a couple of years ago, and there was a great Harvard Business Review article about the manufacturing ecosystem and these sort of feedbacks to innovation. And I think it's true and arguable that manufacturing moves, but eventually development and research can move along with it. And I think, for instance, we may have been talking about the battery industry and the lithium-ion industry, which is now really located abroad in Asia. And I think to some extent, that's true with maybe the semiconductor industry, certainly the LED lighting industry. So yes, there is that danger that you lose manufacturing and you lose that ability to manufacture things, then you have to be concerned that you lose other aspects of your innovation economy too.
Here's a question about anti-Semitism. This person writes, you're the first to mention that there was anti-Semitism at Bell Labs early on. You wrote that it ended in 1944 when Kelley began hiring the first Jews as employees. My recollection of the book, and expand upon this, is that you actually point out that Bell Labs didn't struggle with anti-Semitism in the same way so much of society is. But expand upon that point and to what degree that went on. It's
a great question, and unfortunately there's no anti-Semitism file in the AT&T archives to sort of chart this thing. So I found bits and pieces and from interviews, sometimes off the record with people, tried to sort of piece this together. I think I can say fairly certainly that the strain of anti-Semitism was stronger in the main parts of the phone company than at Bell Labs than it ever was, especially at AT&T. But starting in the war effort, there's some evidence that they passed over hiring Richard Feynman, for instance, because of that. There's a memo I unearthed at the archives of a really blatant case of one of the lab's sort of preeminent engineers, just telling people he just doesn't like Jews. It's kind of a shocking memo to read nowadays. And the war effort did sort of break down the barrier in science very much at the labs, and obviously a great thing. It also brought women into more roles too. There were so many people involved in the war effort that was by necessity, and the management of the labs never looked back after that, which was certainly a laudable thing. Yeah.
How would a similar R&D program work in a non-monopoly environment where projects must justify their existence and their profit in the near term?
I don't know if they can, to be honest. I really don't. I don't know how you can capture the value of really basic research when you are a public company, for instance, and you're investing in that kind of risky, so to speak, research on such a large scale, which is, I think, why government, to some extent, steps into that role.
Let's talk about a couple of other, and then we'll come back to your questions, and do go ahead if you still have more, and we'll get to the rest of these. But a couple of other case studies that I think are interesting and indicative of this question we're exploring about having time. And one of them is the creation of, or the story of figuring out cell phone transmission, which seems like essentially science by driving around, right? I mean, so describe what went on in order to figure out the concept of a cell tower.
I mean, the cell phone story, which actually was one of my favorite parts of writing the book and researching it, by that time it wasn't just small teams of people working on problems in a lab. It was, you know, dozens or hundreds of people working on a very, very big system project. There were different kinds of people working on different aspects of the cellular telephone problem. There were systems engineers in Homedale, New Jersey working on it. There were researchers also at Homedale working on basic knowledge of what happens with antenna transmissions. And these guys, yeah, they would drive, they rented a van, and they literally would drive all over New Jersey testing things in the early 1970s, you know, can you hear me now sort of stuff, trying to understand if, you know, what happens with, you know, it was not completely understood what happens when you drive through a forest or into a tunnel, or what happens with the noise from a mountain, for instance, in the distance. It was not known how far your transmission could travel, and these were very difficult questions. One of the most interesting aspects, I think, of the cell phone effort was that some of the people who solved these problems actually came from the Bell Labs military work. And one guy in particular who I spent a lot of time talking with had done a lot of work on radar, something called discriminatory radar work in Kwajalein in the South Pacific, where Bell Labs had a very small facility working with Western Electric. And at the time, he had come back from this tour of duty where he had worked on these highly sophisticated microwave systems, came back to Bell Labs, and then Bell Labs said they were going to discontinue the kind of thing he was doing. Somebody suggested, hey, why don't you go talk to these guys who are working on cellular? Maybe you have something for them. And it was, again, part of the maybe serendipity of Bell Labs that he was a guy with a kind of knowledge that maybe very few people in the world had at that one particular time. And they drafted him into the project. His name is Jerry Di Piazza. And yeah, soon enough, he had a van, and he was going down to Philadelphia, and had cleared out the van and ripped out the toilets and stuffed it with a lot of electronic equipment, and they would test all the signals to try and make the working cell phone system go.
One of the things that's great about Jon's book is you also get this sense of all these different characters, and I'm going to introduce you to just one more, and then I'll come back to your questions. This is an individual by the name of Claude Shannon, whom many of you may know of. Among his contributions was the term bit, right? That's where that comes from. Is that right?
It's right. Yeah, he borrowed it from John Tukey, who suggested it, who was a statistician, a very, very famous person also as well.
So this is Claude Shannon, and I just want to read this portion, and then Jon can describe what made him so interesting. One year, his wife Betty gave him a unicycle as a gift. Shannon quickly began writing, and then he began building his own unicycles, challenging himself to see how small he could make one that could still be ridden. When he was in the office, Shannon would take a break from his work and ride his unicycle up and down the long hallways of Bell Labs. He would nod to passerbys unless he was juggling as he rode. When he got a pogo stick, he would go up and down the hall on that too. So here was Claude Shannon, a man who rarely showed up on time for work, who often played chess or fiddled with amusing machines all day, who frequently went down the halls juggling or pogoing, who didn't seem to care, really, what anyone thought of him or his pursuits. He did what was interesting. He was categorized as a scientist, but it seemed obvious that he had the temperament and sensibility of an artist. Such a wonderful description. And there was room for him, and for that sort of, for a guy who was pogoing down the hallways at Bell Labs.
Yeah, there really was. I mean, he had earned that kind of ability, I think, to be eccentric. When I talked about the open door policy at Bell Labs, he was the only person I ever heard of who actually closed their door. And nobody complained about it by creating this amazing treatise in 1948, a theory of communications, which eventually became known as information theory. He was really treated or understood to be special.
But in that sense, I mean, part of what's interesting about Bell Labs is that it was in some ways almost like an ivory, not an ivory tower, but had the equivalent of tenured faculty. I mean, people who could just pursue knowledge.
Absolutely, and you know, a lot of the folks who were working in research there would tell me, you know, that it was better than academia because for them they didn't have to apply for grants, for one thing. I mean, they had, you know, vast sums of money they could use for experimentation if they needed to.
And you could use a pogo stick.
You could use a pogo stick too, and you didn't have to teach classes, so you had this freedom to really work on your work.
Bell Labs was funded by the monopoly revenue of AT&T. The government regulators allowed the cost of Bell Labs to be added to every phone bill. An equivalent would be an explicit tax on telephone service with the proceeds going to R&D, would never pass Congress today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you read the first part of that again? That's definitely true.
Bell Labs was funded by the monopoly revenue of AT&T. The government regulators allowed the cost of Bell Labs to be added to every phone bill.
That's right. So about 1 to 1.5% of every person's phone bill essentially went to Bell Labs, and it was like a national laboratory in that sense, in that it was funded by not totally the taxpayers, but by phone subscribers. That's right.
So
for better or for worse.
Is that sort of like mandatory being subscribed to?
Yeah. Right.
And the last remaining questions are all about sort of what the key factors are to innovation. So let's spend a little bit of time in our remaining moments on that factor. If we could sort of walk through those, is it starting with this idea of giving something time and in bringing together a multidisciplinary approach to this problem-rich environment?
I think those were, at least at Bell Labs in this moment of time, and I think different people working in different kinds of innovation will take maybe different lessons out of it. I think having a stream of practical problems, whether that's what you're working on or not, is incredibly vital. I think the multidisciplinary aspect is quite essential, or was quite essential, to their approach to problem solving fairly often. I think freedom for some researchers was incredibly useful. I don't want to give them, sometimes innovations occurred there not because of what management was allowing people to do, but because the researchers decided they were going to defy management. And that there's at least a few instances of that occurring too. And yet that was sometimes allowable as well. Money is very important. Money for the short term, money to hire the best people, money to hire a good number of people who could work together, money that ensures you'll be around for the next year and maybe the next 5 years or the next 10 years. As I see it, I think those are the essential ingredients.
What about the question of whether or not failure? I don't get a sense, I guess where I want to go with this question, John, is I don't get a sense of there being tension. You know, we hear so much about competition and tension, and it's that's what pushes innovation forward. I don't get a great sense in reading the book that there was tension. I mean, there was the Shockley competition, but outside of that, was it a place where there was a lot of competitiveness, where there was tension, where there was, oh my God, if I don't get this done, I'm going to lose my job?
I don't know if there was that. There was competition, and sometimes in later years they would set up competing groups to compete against each other, a kind of internal competition. I think it raises that larger question that I personally think is something which might be seen as maybe the competition myth, that we sort of now kind of equate innovation with market competition, but which is true to some extent, certainly. I think we get, you know, great, amazing consumer products out of that kind of competitive marketplace. But certainly if you look at the history of Bell Labs as a company, as an organization that wasn't really competing with anyone else, you start to wonder, well, you know, how does that happen if we get these breakthroughs out of that? I mean, we got those breakthroughs because it was a place where there was a rich exchange of ideas and a rich exchange of problems that could be solved and then needed to be solved. And I think, to some extent, the big breakthroughs elsewhere, you know, certainly, you know, the internet was not created because of market competition. So, I mean, those big breakthroughs, I think, for the most part, arise out of a kind of need to move ahead, a deep curiosity, a willingness to fail and sort of explore the unknown.
So what do you, in the end, as we come to the end of our conversation, should we take from the Bell Labs story? You said earlier that your book is not an argument for recreating Bell Labs. But what can we take from it that would be useful for us to think about as we think about the problems that we have to solve and the way in which that sort of innovative spirit might be brought to bear on them?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important takeaway for me really is that notion of balancing the short-term high metabolism, innovation economy maybe we have now, and that we admire rightfully quite a bit with a sort of longer-term vision. And I think that can be really vital. And I wonder if things have gotten out of balance a little bit. And to me, that's crucial. I think the other thing, too, is that investments in basic research can pay off in ways that you can't imagine. I saw Bill Gates the other day was saying, it was on the Wall Street Journal website, that we should double our national investment in basic research. I think the Bell Labs string of innovations sort of prove that those investments, those forays, those endeavors into basic science can change the world. They can change the economy. They can create millions of jobs. And they don't pay off quickly, but they pay off in ways that are just amazing.
And could they be then brought to bear on problems like energy, something that's so much in the forefront right now on climate change? Are there things that we can tease out of the successes, at least from Bell Labs, that you could use in attacking some of those problems?
I hope so. I mean, we have our energy secretary was from Bell Labs. Stephen Chu is a Bell Labs alum, and he knows that process better than anyone. I think the reality is that the world is different, and that those sort of larger principles are probably the most valuable things to learn there, as opposed to those specific kinds of ingredients for innovation that were of a time and place, but the sort of larger truths of thinking long terms, of attacking big problems, are essential. And I think, yes, I personally think the great leaps are in energy and in biotechnology, and maybe not in information technology at the moment.
Well, Jon Gertner, thank you for taking us back to that time and place and engaging us in our own version of time travel back to the Bell Labs, the idea factory, and the great age of American innovation. Jon, thank you.
Oh, thanks so much.
Jon Gertner gives us insight into how Bell Labs combined the best of the academic and corporate worlds and produced real breakthroughs that changed the world. There are many stories like this at the Computer History Museum. Join us next time for another episode of Revolutionaries.